Alright guys, you want to talk about it? Let's talk about it. This was some of the most, let's say, David versus Goliath type drafting that I've ever seen. And honestly, big kudos to Fly. The game's just ended, and essentially, this was some of the most creative and like challenge the norm type drafting that I've ever seen. And Fly actually did it. It's not like an int way of doing it, by the way. This is actually a very sound logic behind each of the picks, and they wanted to challenge basically what the needs of the meta were and what Gen G were bringing to the table with very unique picks that no one else was willing to do. And it's not like they're int, you know? It's very, very sound. So I want to go through each game, break it down, why it caused such a ruckus, essentially, for Gen G, especially in a lot of these earlier games. Gen G managed to adapt eventually, but a lot of this stuff really makes a lot of sense. So let's start with game one. Obviously, the Ivern gives a lot of issues for a lot of people to begin with because of the dynamic that it creates as an enchanter jungler, and Fly has been very successful with it the entirety of the tournament, and it kind of it fares well into a lot of the slower facilitator picks that classic Korean and Chinese teams want to pick, right? So the Gen G opened with the Skarner, and Fly actually respond with the Ashe Sarah. This is something that I've been raving more and more about, not as necessarily the Sarah, but more so the Ashe, because it has such a strong matchup spread into basically every AD carry within the pool. That's actually why you see the Ezreal ban on red side here, because it kind of establishes this guaranteed matchup. Every other AD carry, you can think of the Kaisas, the Zayas, the Lucians, like Ashe fares well into all of them, right? And it creates a very unique environment. What makes this even better, actually, is that this Seraphine ended up being a flex pick between support and mid. And so it gives Fly like a really solid option, and in terms of their composition, well, not necessarily composition, but more so in terms of where they want to put their lane assignments, right? Because that X factor is the lane swap, and that's something that they have to keep in mind. They wait for the confirm on the Ahri on 3, and then this is their prepared pick to basically clear the way for this to go mid, and then they can adapt their comp as necessary. So they go Galio on 3 into Rumble because otherwise it would get banned here. And then they default pick jungle on 4 because it's a free pick, plus there's not that many options left. And it creates a composition where they have as many options for as long as possible, but they're using champions that, you know, like people realize are underrated and like no one really kind of taps into. This 4-5 response with the Jinx Leona is actually not bad by Gen G, by the way. The logic behind it is that they've identified that you can't go forward into a comp like this when you have the when you've created the Galio into Rumble matchup trade. And in addition, the only way therefore you can probably win is either through poke or through front to back. And your only options remaining are AD carry and support. Usually your poke options, when you think of that, are all magic damage heavy, but FlyQuest has also already hedged against that because they have champions like Galio. So your only option remaining is essentially to go FTB. So that's why Gen G went for the, I would consider, uncharacteristic Jinx pick, just because they wanted to find a way to not only gain a decent matchup, but also create that win condition where it currently doesn't exist. It is a bit technically more of a salvage situation because they weren't ready for this sort of Ashe Sarah flex, but that's more so like well played by FlyQuest here, I would say. Game 2. Gen G, I want to also point out that draft is all about the adaptations that you make, right? And I think this is a good adaptation by Gen G in order to basically curb them a little bit, right? So right off the bat, you can see the bans. Gen G take blue instead. Sorry, FlyQuest go red instead again. And it ends up being the Ashe one, which I do think should be relatively expected. And then the common matchup, I would say, is the Ezreal, which is available this time. What's interesting about this draft is that Gen G end up cashing in with the Canyon with the Lily this time, and they actually have the Jax blind. And this creates an issue for a team like Fly, because I've mentioned before in their previous games where they're actually pretty weak to a Jax blind or like Renekton blind per se, because they like to rely on late counter picks in specifically top and jungle. This is very unique to them, I would say, because I would say Whipple probably has one of the most unique pools of the entire tournament, and Inspired is willing to pull out some crazy shit, you know, CEO of Full Clear, as you might have seen, and he's very able to tap into all of the wacky stuff that's available in the jungle. So why this Jax creates a problem is because it essentially hedges against every single cool, unique counter pick that Whipple were potentially to bring to offer, or like create a lane advantage out of where other players would not be able to, and he gets stunted by this pick. So there's not many options he has, right? We see the Nunu into the Nidalee, and then we actually see Gen G actually definitely have a prepared pick into this with the Kassadin. This is specifically because they knew that Fly might bring out the Nunu in this series, so they probably had a discussion about what they could do in order to essentially cash in on this. And the Kassadin is basically the answer. The Nunu Ori doesn't have enough output against Gen G in terms of the Kassadin, so it's like it's less about the cash out between the composition of Gen G in particular. It is more so that it's a very specific answer into this FlyQuest comp. So that's why this is a really good adaptation. Then we actually end up switching sides, and we see the Jax get banned, and which I do really like. And then the Ashe priority is basically pick or ban at this point, because both teams have realized how powerful it is and how oppressive it is most of the time, and the draft changes once more. So this draft was really cool because I think FlyQuest realized that they only had a couple of options based on the chain that they've created, right? So two big adaptations here. I think they're not an Aurora team because of the aforementioned like Whipple counter pick. So to them, Aurora Flex is not as good, right? Because they don't really like to flex it that much, right? They'd much rather give Whipple the resources to basically tap in on a pick that they're not ready for, and then, you know, draw as many bans as possible. This is why they also ban the Jax on blue. It gives them more resources to do so, because on red, you're going to probably ban... A lot of your bans are already set up, because you have to ban Yone, you have to ban Ashe, you have to ban Aurora potentially, and you have to give up a lot of things in order to get there. So, at least a Skarner opener, and then Gen G respond with Sejuani Ezreal. Two options here from this point is basically for Fly to match poke, or they go the Kai'Sa route, and they can go for something more aggressive. They opt for the Kai'Sa route, and if they don't take it on the 2-3 here specifically, it will get banned in phase 2, because Gen G are just going to limit the options on bottom side, because that's what Fly would otherwise be missing. So they pick Kai'Sa, and I want to pay your attention to the Rakan pick on 3 specifically, because technically this is a pre-pick into the potential Braum, right? When you pick the Kai'Sa on 2-3, you are giving a little bit of a hint to your opponent that, hey, there is an option, like there is a very good chance that we're going to play decently forward here. So the Rakan ensures like a soft engage in spite of that, right? If you went, let's say, Leona or Rell here, it would be okay, but you wouldn't. There would be a good chance that Braum would be able to peel you off and not be able to get your targets. Rakan can slip right through the Braum, and although Braum is still going to be able to block some projectiles and increase resistances for the related targets, Rakan is still going to be able to lock down both of them, slip right through, and you know, if Fly play the fights really well, you can still kind of secure these fights, right? That's why it's actually a really important pick to pick it here specifically, and if they were to go this route, which is really smart. They also respond with the Urgot into the Renekton, and they actually go the Zeri into the Sylas. This is mainly because FlyQuest are likely not believers in the Tristana tech. I'm also a non-believer in a Tristana tech personally, unless you're like literally the best player in the world at it, and you know, these guys literally are the best players in the world at it, and they still can't really get it out like that well, right? And it's just because the champ sucks now. Riot has really like made sure that like this champ is not really as oppressive as it used to be in mid lane, and although this would be an option against the Sylas, the Zeri is arguably also really strong because it achieves a lot of the same thing that the Sylas, that the oppression on the Sylas, but it also does not give Sylas a really good ult, right? It gives a lot of issues for the Sylas in terms of that as well. So the matchup doesn't necessarily get better as the lane goes on, right? In addition, Gen G actually do cash in the Braum on 5, but I think this might be a misdiagnosis of what FlyQuest's comp actually was. They probably thought, the mindset was likely that they could tap into the Ezreal poke very much, and then they can just play their flights a little slow, right? But two things with that is that I do think this Gen G comp overall, because of it, was lacking a little bit on the damage side, and two, you can kind of tell because when you pick Braum, right, you need to know the conditions for Braum, in which case you have to objectively be the team that wins front to back. And then because of that, it forces FlyQuest to play forward and try to play into Braum's conditions, right? But that's not necessarily the case, as you saw in a lot of these fights. FlyQuest, if you look at all 5 champs here, FlyQuest actually do outscale, and they actually do win front to back if they were to play normally. So that is what ended up happening. A lot of the times, it didn't really matter that the Braum was sort of doing his thing per se, let's put it that way, because FlyQuest just has too much damage, right? It doesn't really matter. There's no targets that FlyQuest necessarily cares about. They're just looking for overall value. You can see, right? It doesn't really matter. It's more about stat checking them than it is about picking off pays, let's say. That would be the main target in this game. It doesn't matter that much, right? And you could think it was incentivized because of the Kai'Sa, but no, FlyQuest made the adjustment, and it ended up working out well in their favor. And this is why they ended up. I actually do like this draft, although it's not, like, let's say, as spicy. What is crazy is these next 2 games. I think it's more like the mindset that they go into it is just something that's like forces Gen G to stay on their toes, right? This is probably the least exciting draft of the entire set, just because it's a little bit awkward, and you can see that on blue. Blue is probably just the de facto sort of priority in this sort of meta because of the Ashe prio, and because of these bans, you're not going to have many options. So you have to give something over to Gen G, right? And this creates a lot of options for Gen G to basically just create the fabled 3 winning lanes, right? And that's kind of what happened. In this case, FlyQuest were basically forced to pick Renekton, otherwise they would have Nidalee Renekton and they would literally lose all over the entire map. So they invested their phase 2 bans into choking support instead. Alternatively, they could ban Rell Renekton or Renekton plus something else, and then they can pick something else on 4. They can pick jungle on 4 and leave Bwipo to 5, or they can pick jungle on top lane on 4 and leave jungle to 5, which they did here. But because of basically the forced Renekton pick here, then they essentially were forced to pick Sejuani in order to get enough like pressure on the map, let's say. But overall, it looks like the comp is like a little bit, let's say, harder to play because of the aforementioned. Like Gen G has a lot of room to breathe, and that's why it was a little bit more awkward. Now to break down the Fiddlesticks draft. This is the most banger one, I would say, out of all 5, and what makes this one, like, I'm not fully surprised that FlyQuest busted this out, because I do think this is a solid route that they have gone through before against certain teams. We've seen the inspired Fiddlesticks more than once. That's why I think it was actually not like, I wouldn't be surprised if Gen G somewhat expected something crazy like that, because it is very sensible, right? You can see them kind of ready for it with the Amumu ban on 3 here, right? Why Amumu on 3? That definitely indicates on the 1-2 you're going to pick like Sejuani, or you're going to pick another facilitator jungler, right? And you can see it here in the Skarner. The point of picking things like Amumu is so that you can take advantage of the fact that they're a facilitator, right? So in exchange, Gen G gave up the Yone, unless they were bluffing for 5 games and they just don't actually play Yone, which would have been crazy, but they just automatically slam Smolder, as you know, they're very confident in the matchup, and that's where the Fiddle comes out. I'm actually surprised they went Fiddle on 2-3, because I think it's possible for them to push it back. It was likely due to the fact that they wanted to get their counter pick out of the way, which makes sense, but it does reveal, there's actually, if you think about it more, this does reveal that it limits FlyQuest's options on their laners much more. They can't pick cash out like slower laners on their remaining sides, because Fiddlesticks himself is a cash out champion, right? He needs help from his laners in order to really solidify himself and get through the game. But then this basically indicates that, all right, let's just pick as many champs as possible that guarantee that we can fare decently well in the early game, and then this Fiddle can't really do anything, right? They're playing, Gen G started drafting with no risk at this point. So they go Kalista on 2-3, and that's why you basically see the Rumble on 3 with Galio ban, because this does the job, right? It guarantees priority. I would have liked to see personally that if you're going to go Fiddlesticks route anyway, this does mean that Busio has to play facilitator or support. So you can just go, you can simply go like Nautilus or Rel here. And I think it would work fine because it's already essentially guaranteed. So you could do that and push jungle to 4-5 and then make it more of a surprise factor. And because of that, it gives Gen G much fewer options in order to respond, and it gives them basically only an R5, right? They would have R5 basically AD or sub, and then it would have been more of like a boom, you know, more impact of the Fiddlesticks. But because of that, then FlyQuest do end up tapping into like a different sort of dynamic in order to force a good matchup into the Rumble with the set. But I think with the comp that Gen G had, it's not quite the, you need more, let's say, forward in terms of this. So other options could have been like Camille here or something like that if you want more like guaranteed engage, but you can't really do that at that point because Camille doesn't have enough oomph to support the fiddle. And this is what I mean, where you maybe there would have been an option to cash in on something else instead, right? Instead of fiddle, you could do something crazy still, but it doesn't have to be fiddle. And you know, I'm sure Inspire could have cooked something else as well, but overall, really sound logic, right? It makes sense. Every single draft, the team is on the same page about it. They understand why they can go for this angle. They look, any pick can be good as long as you create the right conditions around it. And that's what makes this draft so interesting from a North American team. Not many NA teams are willing to be this crazy, right? But FlyQuest, they fully embrace the circus, and Gen G are not ready for it. They're first timers, you know, and they definitely were caught off guard. They made some great adjustments in the end to kind of bring themselves back, but holy, did FlyQuest throw them for a loop. And I want to basically share that sort of magic today with you guys, right? This is some of the most creative drafting that I've seen in a series from any sort of League of Legends draft in any region. And I think, you know, this is something that a lot more teams should try to take note of and be more adventurous for. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you guys today and kind of lead this as like an example for if you're in your Clash team or in your whatever team that you choose to be on, you should try to be creative and really tap into your team's strengths. And that's, you know, it's not necessarily just playing what the meta is, but more so understanding it and adding your unique flair to it. So yeah, that's it from me, guys. Hope to catch you in the next one. See ya.